Just read one verse in chapter 7, and then we'll read the end of the chapter in a little bit. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than one's day of birth. We've reached the halfway point of Solomon's writing, and I think we've achieved a really good understanding of his perspective. He lived life under the sun, and I think we've achieved a good understanding of his pursuit. He ran after life whole hog. A man who was uniquely positioned to have it all and do it all has gone into great detail telling us how he did it, pretty much leaving God out of the picture. Now, in all the things that we've looked at, have you ever thought about what's been missing in these first 6 chapters? Wisdom. He is described and known as the wisest man who's ever lived, and yet wisdom has been missing in action in Solomon's life. Had he been living today, we probably would have described Solomon as having a midlife crisis. And as he becomes rebellious, and I have seen this in others, whether they are people who've never been saved and they don't want to hear about God, or people who at one time had a relationship with God and have backed away from that, what I found is as people become more rebellious, he and they became more cynical toward the things that had been important to them, especially the simplicity and purity of living by faith. He lived life just as hard and as fast as he could, and I love what Chuck Swindoll said about that. He said, funny thing about us humans, we tend to run faster when we have lost our way. And we do. No idea where we're going, but boy, are we making good time. Up until now, Solomon has been describing life under the sun. A horizontal, humanistic approach to life that at best leaves God at the margins, if even there. And where did this life bring him? In chapter 2 he writes, so I hated my life, and I hated all of the fruit of my labor. But something begins to happen here, something important in chapter 7. I believe, not all scholars agree with me, and that's okay. But I believe here, Solomon stops running. And I believe he begins to come back home. I believe he is returning to God. And as he does, wisdom reappears in his life. The words wise and wisdom appear more than 30 times in these final 6 chapters. We even see this wisdom reflected in his style of writing, because beginning with this chapter, he begins to pick up on that style again that he used in writing the book of Proverbs. So let's look at it together. There are 5 things I want to share with you today. The first of these, we read this in verse 1, is guard your name. Let's look at that word ointment for a moment. It can be rendered fragrance or perfume. Do you remember in the Gospels how the woman who anointed Jesus' feet shortly before his crucifixion, she brought that alabaster box of ointment and anointed his feet with that. She used an ointment that in today's economy would have been at least $30,000. Amazing. Now take a step to the side for just a moment. What influences you to choose a restaurant where you've never eaten before? It's not the smell. Most of them smell good. It's the name. It's the reputation. It's what others have said about it. Been a lot of restaurants I've gone to because someone said, you really ought to try it. The food there is amazing. The service is excellent. What does one manufacturer's ad say? The quality goes in before the name goes on. Reputation, character, these carry weight. They exert influence. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how much stuff you have. Your most valuable asset is your name. Make it and keep it a good one. The second thing is live soberly. It's in verses 2 through 4. Now there are about three or four different things Solomon mentions here, but because there's similarities, I'm going to combine them together. Now why does Solomon say these things? Does having wisdom make you sad? Is living for God depressing? No, not at all. He writes what he does because of his perspective. We celebrate birthdays and we mourn days of death, and rightly so. But consider this: the worst thing that can happen to me brings about the best thing that could happen to me. Because when death comes knocking on my door and takes me, I am going to be in the presence of God. And no longer is my life going to be impacted by the effects of sin, like temptation, or loss, or heartache, or disappointment, or sickness, or stress, or suffering, or fear. None of that awaits me in eternity. Our society is addicted to feelings of pleasure and entertainment, looking for that next emotional kick and high. But the harsh reality of death, with the accompanying sorrow and mourning, strips away that which is superficial, and it forces us to get real with ourselves and face life as it is. The story is told that on the Titanic there was a woman who was in a lifeboat that was about to be downloaded into the North Atlantic. And suddenly she remembered something she absolutely had to have, and she begged the seaman that was in that boat to hold off and let her go back to her stateroom. And he gave her 3 minutes. If she wasn't back, they were going to leave her. She flew just as quick as she could. She ran through the casino with all the piles of money scattered all over the floor, ran past that, got to the estate room, shoved past all the jewel-encrusted diamonds and jewelry that she had, and reached and grabbed 3 small oranges and raced back to the boat and made it in time. Perspective. It really does determine our values. And in verses 2 through 4, Solomon is not saying that wisdom makes you sad. Solomon is not saying that serving God is depressing. What Solomon has done is he has lost interest in the silly side of life, and he's now living with eternity in view. The third thing that I see here is in verse 5. And that is, we need to accept rebuke. Many, if not most of us, at least at some point in our life, we fail to hear the rebukes of the wise. And that's because rebukes are hard to hear. When we are rebuked, it rattles our cage. It stings our pride. It's often delivered in a tone that is strong, maybe even harsh, and necessarily so. Why do I say sometimes if it's harsh, it's necessary? Allow me to share excerpts from John Ehrlichman's book, Witness to Power. For those of you who don't know, who are young enough, you don't know who John Ehrlichman is. He was in the inner circle of President Richard Nixon. He had a powerful position in our government, and he was heavily involved in the Watergate scandal. This is a part of what he wrote. When I went to jail nearly 2 years after the cover-up trial, I had a big self-esteem problem. I was a felon, shorn and scorned, clumping around in a ragged old army uniform, doing pick and shovel work out in the desert. I wonder if anyone thought I was worth anything. For years, I have been able to sweep most of my shortcomings and failures under the rug and not face them. But during the 2 long criminal trials, I spent my days listening to prosecutors tell juries what a bad fellow I was. Then at night, I'd go back to a hotel room and sit alone thinking about what was happening to me. During that time, I began to take stock. I stayed about 2 weeks. Every day I read the Bible, walked on the beach, and sat in front of my fireplace, thinking and sketching with no outline or agenda. I had no idea where all this was leading or what answers I would find. Most of the time, I didn't even know what the questions were. I just watched and listened. I was wiped out. I had nothing left that had been of value to me. Honor, credibility, virtue, recognition, profession, nor did I have the allegiance of my family. I had managed to lose that too. Since about 1975, I've begun to learn to see myself. I care what I perceive about my integrity, my capacity to love and be loved, and my essential worth. I don't miss Richard Nixon very much, and Richard Nixon probably doesn't miss me much either. I can understand that. I've made no effort to be in touch. We had a professional relationship that went as sour as a relationship can, and no one likes to be reminded of bad times. Those interludes, the Nixon episodes in my life, have ended. In a paradoxical way, I'm grateful for them. Somehow I had to see all of that and grow to understand it in order to arrive at the place where I find myself now. Sometimes it takes time and pain and loss before good counsel is heard. One of the most frustrating things that I've had as a pastor, that I've had as a parent, that I've had as a son, is people will come to me asking for my advice, and I realize in the conversation they don't really want it. They just simply want me to affirm a decision that they have already made. I can't be of much help to people in those situations. Coming to terms with reality includes being open to the rebukes of the wise, even if they say it inelegantly and harshly, even if it comes from a person that I may not particularly like very much. I need to hear the words of wisdom. The fourth thing that I would share with you is the better end in verse 8. The end that is better, not bitter. Solomon writes, the end of the matter. To quote one writer, the end of the matter is maximum reality. We know the whole story. There's no more unrealistic expectations, no more bumbling through ignorance, no longer being caught off guard. How many times have you and I said in our lives, if only, if only? There are places in my life where those words haunt me too. But now that we know, let's take what we have learned, let's apply it to our lives going forward. That is wisdom. Let's not be like the fools described in 2 Timothy chapter 3, where Paul writes they are ever learning, but never coming to the knowledge of the truth. And then fifth, patience over pride. That's verses 8 through 10. I have been a follower of Jesus Christ for nearly half a century, and sad to say, I still struggle here. How much better it is to wait than to blow off steam. How much better it is to allow room for the Holy Spirit to work than to rush in and make a big mess. How much better to realize that all red lights do in fact turn green instead of just sitting there getting flustered. I can tell you I am making progress, but I still have a ways to go. I can also tell you, sadly, on the authority of experience, an angry life is a self-destructive life. And it generates a lot of fallout that harms others. A patient spirit provides the platform upon which the Spirit of God can work to transform my life and others. And wisdom is the resulting fruit. And while we're at it, let's stop languishing over yesterday. Yesterday ended last night. Today is today. It will never again be yesterday. As I said in the opening message of this series, we have arrived at our Rocky Mountain moment. And the world that stretches out in front of us is different from the world that we have left behind. But even in the midst of this tremendous change through which we are going, this hinge point of history I've shared with you before, we know and we have assurance that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And His love and His grace and His wisdom are sufficient for us in the gut-wrenching reality in which you and I may find ourselves today. Now, why does wisdom matter? Why should I spiritually stay home? Or if I've been a prodigal, if I've wandered, why should I spiritually come back home? The reason is because the popular culture wishes to throw off all restraint. So why not give full vent to my emotions and express and act out my desires and passions in the moments? This is why wisdom is important. And this, look at what Solomon writes beginning in verse 11. Wisdom along with an inheritance is good and an advantage to those who see the sun. For wisdom is protection just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what He has bent? In the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other so that man may not discover anything that will be after him. The reason why we need to stay home, the reason why we need to come back home if we've wandered, the reason why we need to pursue wisdom, as Solomon wrote in the Proverbs, as if we were looking for gold or silver, is because it offers us two essential benefits that we need to live successfully. The first is wisdom preserves us from the human pitfalls of pride and doubt, disillusionment, resentment, and bitterness, because life is hard. But second, it provides our lives with divine perspective. Because we're wise, we know that God is sovereign. We know that God is in control. He is in charge. So if life are times good, enjoy them. Are times hard? Remember, because no matter how hard life becomes, God is no less caring and God is no less involved when life is difficult. God's ultimate design for my life, for you, for everyone on this planet and the universe, His plan is perfect. He has a plan that will be fulfilled. So let's walk by faith and let's live with wisdom. Amen. Let's live with wisdom.